People can disappear for a variety of reasons. For some, they simply want to get away from their old life and start fresh somewhere else. Some are taken against their own will, while others don't realize they're missing in the first place. Whatever the circumstances surrounding a disappearance, there's almost always someone wanting to know what really happened. Some missing person cases can remain mysteries for years or even decades, but thankfully others do get answers. These are 5 solved missing persons cases. Number 5. Winston Bright was a 42-year-old married father of 3 when he went missing on his way home from work in Lower Manhattan. He'd called his wife at lunchtime and during the call told her he would be home at his usual time. He called her again when he was on his way home. However, Winston never made it back, and his wife, Leslie Bright, started a 10-year search for her husband. The search made little progress. There were no signs of a struggle, and nobody came forward with any information. In 2000, Leslie asked a court to declare her husband legally dead, a request the court granted. This allowed Leslie, as his widow, to claim Winston's pension from the New York telephone company where he had worked. Everything changed for the family in 2007 when, out of the blue, they received a phone call from a man claiming to be Winston. The man called himself Kwame Sekou, and he said he'd been working as a teacher in San Diego. According to Kwame, he found himself wandering the streets of San Diego with no memory, identification, or money in 1990. He had no recollection of who he was or how he had gotten to San Diego. He adopted the name Kwame Sekou after seeing it in a magazine and was eventually trained as a teacher as he got his life back on track. Over the years, bits and pieces of his memory would come back, and an acquaintance from the Jehovah's Witness group helped put the pieces together and identified Kwame as Winston. Most of his family welcomed him back with open arms, but Leslie was suspicious. He seemed focused on getting his pension back from her, and she believed he'd simply run out on her. He took a DNA test confirming he was who he said he was, although whether he really did lose his memory remains a mystery. Number 4. The disappearance of Lucy Ann Johnson was one of the oldest missing person cases in Canadian history when the case finally received a happy ending in 2013. Lucy was a 25-year-old mother of 2 when she went missing from her home in British Columbia back in 1961. However, it wasn't until 1965 that her husband Marvin actually reported her missing. At first, he didn't tell police just how long she had been missing, but when neighbors reported they hadn't seen or heard from Lucy in 4 years, he admitted she'd been missing for much longer than he had first said. Neighbors also informed police they'd seen Marvin digging a septic tank in his backyard around the time Lucy had disappeared. Suspecting foul play, police excavated the yard in 1965 but found no sign of Lucy. After initial suspicion, police could find no signs Marvin had been involved in the disappearance, and eventually the case went cold. Police tried comparing Lucy's DNA to a number of Jane Doe's, but there were never any matches. Marvin passed away from natural causes in the 1990s, taking any information he knew with him and leaving his daughter Linda questioning what had happened to her mother. Linda had only been 8 years old when her mother disappeared. Her brother, a year younger than her, passed away in his teens. For a long time, Linda assumed her mother was dead, but in 2013, she renewed efforts to find out what had really happened. If her mother had run away, Linda figured she may have gone back to Alaska where she'd been born. On a whim, she posted an advertisement in the local paper, giving a description of Lucy, her name and date of birth, and her grandparents' names. Surprisingly, the plan worked. Linda received multiple emails and then phone calls. One was from a woman named Rhonda, who believed Lucy was her mother. Linda followed the lead and eventually confirmed Rhonda was really her half-sister. Lucy not only hadn't been killed, but she was still alive at the time and started a new family in Yukon. Lucy and Linda were reunited, and Linda eventually admitted Marvin had been abusive. She tried to flee with Linda and her brother, but Marvin refused, so she left alone. Number 3. Craig Williamson vanished while on a business trip in August of 1993 and remained missing for more than 2 years. Craig met his wife, Christine Reinhard, in the fall of 1990. They found they had a lot in common and started dating immediately. Within a month, they were married. Just a year later, they decided to go into business together, starting a fish farm where Craig would raise tilapia for restaurants and markets. The couple sunk $80,000 of their own money into the venture, as well as borrowing from Christine's father and the bank, so they were under some pressure to make the business work. On August 28th, Craig set off to a fish farm he'd been doing business with in Colorado, with plans to shop around for some backup generators. Christine was worried about him driving at the time. It was only a month or so after he'd been given a concussion, so she thought it was dangerous for him to drive, but he chose to make the trip anyway. His search for generators took him to Colorado Springs, and it was there on August 30th that he last spoke to his wife. He checked into a motel and called his wife. He asked her to call him at 5:30 a.m. the following day so he could get an early start on the trip back. When the time came, Christine called 3 times, and when she got no response, called the front desk, but Craig had vanished. Craig's credit cards were found at a market the day he disappeared. The rental car that he had was discovered 2 weeks later across the Mexican border. There were no signs of foul play, but Christine was sure her husband must have been attacked and was now suffering memory loss. Christine worked hard to find her husband. Despite the police asking her to stop her own investigation, she followed leads, searching up and down a train line after a retired nurse claimed to have seen someone matching Craig's description on a train. It was only after the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries that Christine got an answer. In July of 1995, a man living in Key West, Florida, was watching a re-airing of the show when he recognized himself. Craig claimed that he'd been mugged in Colorado Springs and developed amnesia, like Christine had suspected. After the attack, he woke up in a hospital bed with the name Ron. For a while, he wandered aimlessly through the US before arriving in Key West, where he worked as a driver. After realizing his true identity, he contacted Christine and met up with his wife and his family. Unfortunately, this could not jog his memory, and the couple later divorced, although they remained friends. Despite the claims, some suspect Craig's disappearance was staged and that he'd run away to escape debts from starting his business. Number 2. When Timothy Carney was located and taken off the missing persons register in 2012, it didn't really answer many of the questions his family had been asking for the past 7 years. Timothy was part of a close-knit family, all of whom were certain he wouldn't have disappeared without letting them know. However, on September 28, 2004, he did just that. He was last seen by his housemate leaving their apartment in New Jersey. As he left, he called his employer to tell him he was running late, but Timothy never showed up for work. He was reported missing the same day, and 4 days later, his car was found abandoned at an intersection in Newark. A few days after that, $1,000 was withdrawn from his bank account. After that, there was no sign of him. Timothy's parents spent years looking for their son, working with a national missing persons organization to put up billboards in the hope someone could help them locate him. Throughout the investigation, there was one group of people who received a great deal of interest. While he was at college, Timothy had joined the Gospel Outreach Church. Over the years, he became more committed to the church, and his family even believed he was being controlled by it. He appeared to change and donated a large portion of his salary to the church, often having to borrow money from coworkers to buy food for himself. He would get defensive if anybody asked about it and claimed it was just a normal church, but his friends and family weren't so sure. In the years since Timothy's disappearance, more and more about the church has come to light, including multiple lawsuits against defectors who claimed they were pressured into giving up their salaries. One former member who knew Timothy claimed the church disapproved of visiting family outside of church, but Timothy broke the rule as he was so close to his parents and siblings. In September of 2011, Timothy was located, but didn't want his family to know where he was. He later said the religious theories were wrong and that he simply didn't want to be around his family anymore, something many people believe is due to the church's influence. Even though they didn't have their son back, Timothy's parents said they were just glad that he was safe. Number 1. In May of 1977, after an argument with his mother and her husband, 19-year-old Harold Wayne Lavelle packed his bags and left his Chicago home for a construction job in Aurora. He wouldn't come back for 30 years. At first, his family weren't too worried about him, but the following year, news broke about the crimes of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy preyed upon teenage boys and young men. Many of his victims were young men who worked for his company, which redesigned, maintained, and decorated properties in Chicago. Harold fit the profile of the serial killer's preferred victims, and as he told his family about a construction gig that he had, they began to fear he may have ended up working for Gacy. The fear only became even more of a reality when authorities searched Gacy's home and found jewelry Harold's mother confirmed belonged to her son. In 2011, the Cook County Sheriff's Department prepared to compare DNA of the 8 identified Gacy victims against the DNA of people who had disappeared during his spree using new analysis techniques. Harold's family, like the family of more than 100 other missing people, reached out to ask for their loved one's DNA to be included in the search. However, while they waited for the results, one of Harold's nephews made a discovery of his own. He had typed his uncle's name into a mugshot database and found a match. A man named Harold Wayne Lavelle had been arrested for marijuana possession in Florida in 2006. The mugshot bore a resemblance to Harold's brother, and the family contacted him. It turned out this really was their long-lost relative. Harold had in fact worked for Gacy for a time, and Gacy had even tried to lure him back to his home, but Harold had declined the offers. The money wasn't good enough, so Harold continued his travels, eventually making it to Florida, where he made a life for himself, not realizing what his family thought had happened to him. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.